Hi guys, this is Ben. In my last video I talked about popular movies that I don't like. In this video I'm going to take a look at the opposite end of the spectrum. I'm going to look at movies I do like that are actually very unpopular. Now, a couple of these are guilty pleasures. I'm not saying that every movie on this list is deserving of praise. I'm just saying that I personally don't dislike them as much as the rest of the world wants me to. Although there are some movies on this list that I think are very unappreciated and that I would really recommend to other people. But let's not waste any more time. This is the top 5 movies that nobody likes except me. Number 5. The Hobbit trilogy. It feels kind of ironic putting this trilogy of movies on this list, considering that the Lord of the Rings trilogy was mentioned in my last video. Like I said before, I watched the first Hobbit movie without watching the Lord of the Rings, so I had nothing to compare it to. I went in with no idea what I was in for, and I was absolutely blown away by this movie, so I couldn't understand where all the hate was coming from when I realised that other people didn't like it. I think that a contributing factor would be that people were comparing it to the Lord of the Rings movies, and to be honest, I understand that. If I was a Lord of the Rings fan, I'm sure that I would have done the same thing. I think a lot of people went into the first Hobbit movie with high expectations, and when those expectations weren't met, it pretty much killed any chance of them liking the rest of the trilogy. But as a brand new viewer with no Lord of the Rings experience at all, I really enjoyed the first Hobbit movie, and I enjoyed the other movies that came after it. I honestly think that might be another reason why I don't like the Lord of the Rings, because I went into that trilogy with high expectations after watching the first Hobbit movie, and it didn't quite live up to what I thought it was going to be. For a lot of other people, it was actually the other way around. Although, with that said, I know that unreasonably high expectations aren't the only reason why so many people hate the Hobbit trilogy. People have also criticised the length of the movies, the slow pace in some scenes, and the technology that they used. Honestly, none of that stuff bothered me. I found the Hobbit trilogy really compelling thanks to the performances of the cast, the funny jokes, the interesting story, and the epic action scenes that didn't overstay their welcome, unlike the action scenes in The Lord of the Rings that I hated so much. So I really didn't mind the length or pace of these movies, and about the high frame rate and the abundance of CGI, honestly, I didn't even notice any of that stuff. I guess I was so engrossed in these movies that it all just went completely over my head. I understand how the Hobbit trilogy could be considered a disappointment if you're a big Lord of the Rings fan, but as somebody who's not, I really enjoyed these movies for what they were. I will admit that the Hobbit trilogy isn't perfect. There are plenty of silly and dumb moments, but I really liked these movies a lot. If I'd watched The Lord of the Rings first, like I was supposed to, I might hate these movies just as much as everyone else does. But sometimes life doesn't quite work out the way you expect it to. Number 4. Howard the Duck. This is widely considered to be one of the worst films ever made throughout the entire history of cinema, up there with the likes of The Room and the Garbage Pail Kids movie. And when I heard that for the first time, I thought, wow, I've got to see this. So I watched the movie for the sheer fun of it, expecting a train wreck, and I was actually pleasantly surprised. I'm pretty sure that it's because I went in with such low expectations. If I'd gone into Howard the Duck expecting a good movie, I'm certain that I would have been disappointed. But I honestly didn't dislike this movie at all. I think it's a little bit underrated. I'm not saying that it's a good movie by any stretch of the imagination. There are many questionable moments that really shouldn't have been included, and some of the acting is downright poor. But in spite of that, I still felt compelled to keep watching. At no point did I think to myself, wow, this is dreadful, what am I doing with my life? I guess this movie was kind of like a guilty pleasure experience, and not even in a so bad it's good kind of way. I actually did really enjoy it. I guess that just goes to show how powerful expectations can be. If you go into something expecting it to be terrible, you might actually have a good time with it. It's definitely not one of my all-time favourites, and I wouldn't go out of my way to watch it on a regular basis, but I definitely don't regret watching it for the first time. I thought it was a really fun way to spend a couple of hours. I completely understand why this movie gets a lot of hate because, like I said before, it's not a good film, but what I don't understand is why it gets as much hate as it does. It's definitely not perfect, and I can understand why it would get some negative reviews, but to call it one of the downright worst films ever made? For me, that's a step too far. Howard the Duck is no masterpiece, but I do think it gets a bit more criticism than it really deserves. Number 3. Cars 2. This is a particularly infamous one because it nearly destroyed the reputation of Pixar, one of the biggest names in the animation industry. This was their first and so far only movie to garner a genuinely negative reaction from critics and audiences. Even their other not-so-good movies like Brave and The Good Dinosaur still got decent reviews. Many people were disappointed in this movie for making the comic relief character the main focus and for just generally having no reason to exist in the first place. This is a sequel that absolutely nobody was asking for. In fact, some people accuse this movie of being nothing more than a cash grab that was rushed out just to make a profit. So yeah, this movie wasn't exactly welcomed with open arms, and because of that, I was a bit nervous when I went into it for the first time. But I actually really enjoyed this movie. It's got a lot of stupid moments, definitely, but I really enjoyed the action in Cars 2. It's all about spies and secret agents, kind of like Pixar's attempt at a James Bond movie. I thought the action scenes here were genuinely entertaining, and I also really liked the story. I love a good mystery where the characters are trying to solve a crime and you're sort of figuring it out along with them. I will admit that the ending twist was very predictable, but I still enjoyed the build-up to the ending. I still enjoyed the journey. There is one problem that I have with Cars 2, which did prove to be a bit of a distraction while I was watching it, and that problem is that there's honestly no reason for this to be a sequel to Cars in the first place. The first movie was about racing, and this movie is about international espionage. Why couldn't it have just been its own intellectual property? Maybe this movie started as a standalone film with different characters, and then along the way it turned into a Cars sequel, but it is a little bit confusing. But fortunately, this issue wasn't quite distracting enough to stop me from enjoying this movie. Cars 2 is not one of Pixar's best movies, but I definitely don't regret watching it. Number 2. The modern Adam Sandler movies. Adam Sandler has always been an actor that critics have hated but audiences have loved. A lot of his classic movies from the 90s, despite being very profitable, got a lot of negative reviews. Flash forward to nowadays, and not only do critics still hate him, but his fan base have gradually turned against him, and now he's become an actor that nobody likes. To be honest, I don't get it. I don't understand how people can love his old movies but hate his new ones. The thing is, there's really not that much of a difference between the classic Sandler films and the modern Sandler films. In the 90s, he made movies like Billy Madison, Happy Gilmore, The Waterboy, Big Daddy, dumb comedies with lowbrow humour, but everyone really liked them. In recent years, he's made movies like I Now Pronounce You Chuck and Larry, You Don't Mess with the Zohan, Just Go With It, Blended. Again, these are all dumb comedies with lowbrow humour, but for some reason, nobody liked them. And not to mention, Adam Sandler still works with a lot of the same writers and directors that he worked with back in the 90s. So the Adam Sandler formula hasn't really changed in the last 20 years. So what went wrong exactly? Why did all of Adam Sandler's fans suddenly lose interest in him? That's a genuine question. I don't get it. I mean, they're not all masterpieces. I'm not a big fan of Jack and Jill or Grown Ups, but I've enjoyed the majority of his modern movies. In fact, there's one movie in particular where I just can't wrap my head around where all the hate comes from, and that's Pixels. This movie received extremely negative reviews and is widely considered to be one of the worst movies that Adam Sandler has ever made. How? I loved every second of this movie. It's got great action, it's got great effects, it's really funny, it's packed full of geeky references. There's a bit in the middle where they poke fun at British accents. I think this is one of Adam Sandler's all-time greatest movies, and I don't understand why it's so overwhelmingly hated. How this movie can be considered one of his all-time worst is beyond me. I feel like Pixels could have been on this list all on its own, but it felt necessary to include all of Adam Sandler's modern movies. I've just never understood why they get so much hate. I still prefer a lot of his old movies, but to say that his modern ones aren't worth watching, I just don't agree with that. Number 1. The Black Cauldron. When people think of classic Disney movies, they usually think of Beauty and the Beast, The Lion King, The Jungle Book, Cinderella, Snow White, but this movie very rarely gets brought up. Disney have distanced themselves from it over the years, and honestly, I would wager that a lot of Disney fans don't even know about it. It's now gained a reputation as the absolute worst Disney movie ever made, but not necessarily for the right reasons. The problem with The Black Cauldron wasn't that it was a bad movie, it was an unsuccessful movie. It was a box office disaster, and reviews were not too enthusiastic. The Black Cauldron was such a catastrophic failure that it nearly bankrupted Disney entirely. That's why it's become so infamous, but if you actually judge the movie on its own rather than the impact that it had, it's actually a lot better than people make it out to be. The Black Cauldron is a dark fantasy movie, and it's drastically different from any other film in Disney's library. There are no songs, there's an overwhelmingly dark atmosphere, and it's a lot more mature than other Disney movies. The Black Cauldron completely abandons the traditional Disney formula. That might sound like a criticism, but it's actually not. Don't get the wrong idea, I love the classic Disney movies, but every now and then it's nice to have a change of scenery, to experience something new, and The Black Cauldron was a breath of fresh air. I really wish that Disney would try to tell more stories like this, but considering how much of a disaster this movie turned out to be, I don't think that's going to happen for some time. This movie came out in the 1980s, which was a golden age for fantasy movies. It was the same decade that we got movies like Labyrinth, Legend, Willow, The Dark Crystal, but all of those movies have gone on to become cult favourites, whereas The Black Cauldron is still largely unappreciated. This is a fine example of a great movie that just didn't do as well as it was supposed to. It's now recognised as Disney's worst movie, but through no fault of its own, and I find that really tragic. I really hope that The Black Cauldron can gain a new reputation someday. If you're a fan of dark fantasy, or if you've already seen all the most famous Disney movies and you want to try something new, I would highly recommend this movie. It's a lot better than the general consensus would have you believe. The Black Cauldron has more than enough potential to become just as popular as the other classic fantasy movies from the 1980s. All it needs is a bit of support. It just needs more people to give it a chance. But until that happens, The Black Cauldron is the #1 movie that nobody likes except me. But of course, I'm not the only person on the internet with an opinion. Feel free to let me know what you guys think of these movies. Do you hate them just as much as everyone else does? Do you find some of them a bit underrated? And feel free to let me know if there are any really unpopular movies out there that you're a big fan of. So until next time, peace out, YouTube.